Hello, welcome everybody. I hope you guys are having a great presentation. So day of event, I'm gonna talk about like how we change pipelines. I'm afraid that would be too boring of a topic, so I would decide to say like the reasons behind first, and it always starts with a story. And if we're gonna talk about story, I like to give some structure. So if you guys know the work of Joseph Campbell, he wrote like this book about the hero with a thousand faces, and I think it gives like a very nice yeah, structure for a storytelling. So I follow that to tell my own story. So his book, he always say like it starts with the ordinary world where you actually introduce the characters and the things that everything looks fine before. So and one of his quotes is like, "You were the hero of your own story." So let me talk a little bit about me. I'm Andre. I come from Brazil, and don't get me wrong, I love 3D Studio Max. It was the software I started learning like when in 1997, I think, when I started. I moved to the US. I learned some animation there. I went back to Brazil and I started working on my first game in 2004. We were making the first Brazilian MMORPG based on Brazilian culture. Later, I moved to Spain and I lived there for many years until I got my Spanish citizenship. I had the chance also to work in Social Point, where actually I started working in the mobile industry, where I work nowadays. And during this entire time, I always worked with 3D Studio Max. So I can say like 3D Studio Max was my core thing. I moved to Hamburg to work at InnoGames and to work in this game called The Lost Survivor. And it was very well established pipeline. It was like the pipeline that I used to work with before. We used to use 3D Studio Max to make the models, sometimes ZBrush to like sculpt some things, and then Retopo. Use UV layouts to generate UV, 3D code to do paint the texture, and send them to Photoshop to polishing. It's like the thing that I always work. So in the culto, in the Joseph Campbell says like when you have like the hero, you always have a moment that comes and call for an adventure, and sometimes even something that's beyond his control, and that actually happens to us. This is something very normal that happens in the games industry, and you guys gonna eventually pass through it. Unfortunately, our game got canceled because things happened, and the company offered me the possibility to move to the marketing team, and that was like a very scary part for me right then because I always worked in the real time, and when I moved to marketing, there was no pipeline defined at all. It was like one of our compositors used to use Cinema 4D. And in the marketing department, I would work with assets from all games and from all different teams. And some of them used Maya, some of them used 3D Studio Max. And we also had like different version of 3D Studio Max. So I would have to ask the team like, oh, can you export in a different version? So there was already some challenges involved in there. And also, I would be changing from real time to actually rendering time. So there was like my all my knowledge of like optimization that was like kind of a little bit pointless in that thing. So I would have to learn like a rendering engine. Like, should I use Corona? Should I use Redshift, V-Ray, or Arnold? There are so many possibilities. And back then in my head, like, when I used to live in Barcelona, when I worked for Social Point, some of my teammates actually used the Blender, and they start talking about cycles, and that's why I heard about cycles before. And cycles is like this PBR rendering engine, like a biased rendering engine. So I was like, well, if I have to learn something, why not learn Blender, right? So it's like that should be the obvious choice, because if I learned Blender, like I could just install in the machines, and we wouldn't need to have like render farms. We could just use all the computers we have in the marketing team to make our images. So you get to this point in the history that you actually have to find a mentor. And that's like finding a person that used the Blender in the InnoGames wasn't that easy back then. So you have to find your own resource. So this is like a great resource if you want to learn Blender. CG Cookie site is awesome. They have very good tutorials. The Blender Cloud, the Blender Institute provides a lot of good tutorials that you can subscribe and get all the information. They share all the production, how they make their assets. You can download them, study them, dissect them. And they also have like the famous donut. Of course, everybody knows about the donut. If you haven't done them, yeah, you have to. A Master CEO, and it's like this little robot. This guy was like the godsend for me to get into speed with Blender. And of course, you have the YouTube channel of the Blender Live if you want to keep up to date with all the information. So then you get to this point, like the crossing thresholds, like this point in the history where there is no turning back. Like the character has gone the furthest he ever been. Like that's like the picture, very famous picture from Lord of the Rings, right? So Cortés said, like, when he conquered the Aztec Empire, that was like one thing he told his teammates: if you want to conquer, you have to burn your boats. So the metaphor this is like, I had to uninstall 3D Studio Max because when I was in the market team, even though I had the Blender installed, I was still using Max to do my things and just moving to Blender to handle, and that was not very productive at all. So when you burn your boats, actually you have to face your challenge. That is like no turning back. And then you get to the road of trials, because that's when you really see like, wow, there is some challenging things coming ahead of me. And if you see like just the amount of shortcuts you have for Blender, oh my gosh, I had like this image posted on my desk, background image on the desktop. Every day I was losing it, looking at this, and I had like some teammates from the market team making some fun of me, like, "Wow, dude, what is that?" And this is just one of them. There is like many images like this of how many shortcuts you can have. And also, like, what is this 3D cursor, this little ball that every time I click with the back demo, because they still use the right click select, every time I would press the left click, it would just move this thing and not select anything. So Blender was so alien to me back then. But you go slowly, and there is like this quote from, I think, from Zelda: "It's dangerous, so don't go alone. So get this sword." And actually, that's like I joined community. That's like the best way if you want to learn. Get a community. Go to chats. Like Blender Chats is an official one. And more important of all, I started a Slack channel inside InnoGames about Blender, and that I gotta tell you, this is like one of the best things I ever done. I got to get like, more people enjoying like to use Blender. We could share information among each other, and then we were like teaming up to study. That really pushes you for developing. And also there is like the Blender conference. The Blender conference actually started today. If you guys don't want to find out later, you can all watch it on YouTube. And there's also the Blender Day, the meetup days that happen 24 hours during whole places of the world. They have some presentation, and you can watch all this online for free. So Blender is awesome because they share so much information, and if you want to get into, go for it. And I discovered new possibilities that I could do directly inside Blender. I could sculpt on it. I didn't have to go to ZBrush to just do some little sculpts. I could do some shader altering on it. I could like make my whole shaders. I used to use the full shader setup from Max that is very like easy to do, but like this opens so much more possibilities. It has compositing. Back then was in the marketing that really helped us a lot because I didn't have like to go to Photoshop just to do some color calibration. I could do directly inside Blender and just handle with the right color profile. Texture painting, I didn't need to use like a 3D code to just texture paint. I could just go directly on my file and paint. And the thing, my favorite of all, was annotations. This for me was a godsend. It's like you can just draw on space, like in 3D space. Like, I know that Maya has something called the grease pencil, and this is like was there, and it's so easy. And the best thing, shortcuts, is consistency, because like the shortcuts, after you get to know how they work the same in all modules of Blender. And I'm getting old. It's like it is hard when you work in like 3D Studio Max and then you go to ZBrush. The shortcuts is completely different. The way you work with them is different. And if you go to Photoshop, it's again different. And then you have Unity and you have like all this stuff, and this is like it makes your head just explode. So when I noticed like I could just be in Blender my whole day, my life got so much better. And then you get to this stage in the story, the apotheosis, like the hero really learned the thing, so he can go for it, right? So I decided to just use Blender. Oh, mostly. I still had like sometimes go to Photoshop to retouch some things. So I just put like some image of the image that I produced for marketing back then. One thing that I really liked on Blender is like that once you have the character rigged, you can just like sculpt on you could pose the character and just use like the multi-res and sculpt things. So I sculpt all the clothing in pose, and I can just reposition it and it still works. I didn't have to go back and forth between softwares. And here you can see like the other one with the Mount Rushmore. I was doing the composition of the image directly in Blender with the annotation tools. I could just like position some rocks, sculpt a little bit of a face, and then draw. And then I could just show the art director, say like, "Do you like this?" And then I could position the camera and do another one. So it was like it it made my life much better because like the speed that I got with it. And then we get to the point that we have to develop in the pipeline. This is like we're getting more to the present day. After my time on the marketing, we decided to start a new game, and it was a game based on the original Lost Survivor. So now it's Lost Survivors. And since I worked on the previous one, I was invited to be back on the team. And since it was like in the beginning of the project, we could actually redefine the pipeline. We would be a very small team. So I asked by my lead if we could just use Blender instead. And I have to say that he was very open to the idea. That's one thing that's very nice of InnoGames. Like you're open to new things. And if you can explain why, the reasons, they can go for it. But he asked me like you're gonna need to support the team. For people who doesn't know, the people who use Max and doesn't know how to use Blender, you might have to support them. And for me, that was like even better because if you really want to learn something, you have to teach it. That's the best way to learn. Even if you're not professional, just try to teach someone. You're gonna see like all your flaws and your knowledge back then. So this is just some of the advantage that Blender brought to our team, right? We could like prototype shaders directly inside Blender before actually even going to Unity, because as I said, there was beginning of the project, so we didn't have like our technical artists join the team yet. So for our game, we don't have that many textures. So one shader we developed was like this. We had like this Atlas gray texture, and we would use shaders just to tint the characters. So, but first we did like a pass through inside Blender to see how that would work, and then you could even like paint the texture directly there, paint the masks. Everything could be done directly into Blender before even moving to the game engine. Another thing is like since Blender is free and everybody can install, and we have like amazing developers working in our team, we didn't have like to buy a special license just for a 3D artist to make a Max script for us. We could just ask the developers, hey, can you download and like to explain him what the tool would need to do, and he could just code directly a tool specific for a pipeline, right? That was like another great advantage that I don't have a slide for it was like speed, because like sometimes when you have a new team member, you have to go for a Jira ticket to ask for a license. You have to wait for the license to get bought and then to install. If you want to change version, you have to buy a new version. With Blender, you can just go direct to the website, install, done. It's like you can go into production in like 5 minutes. It's super fast. Some other advantage that it brought to us, the vertex color for Blender is so much better than it is to do in 3D Studio Max. And we use vertex color a lot in our game because, like as I said, we don't want to have too many textures because texture use too much memory. So what we do is like we paint the vertex color on the building, and we have an atlas texture that we overlay with the inside the Unity. And that's actually we tried before into Blender because you have the compositing mode. So we try like different overlay systems and see and blend them together. And now Blender even have like this Eve render engine that's pretty much like a game engine. So it gets very close to how actually it's gonna look like inside Unity before even export. And if you ever done like a skinning in 3D Studio Max, and if you find like, oh, there is a gap in your model, and then you have like to edit your vertex count, man, you're having trouble. You're gonna have to paint it all over again. But Blend actually stores your weight painted in the vertex data. So it's amazing how much you can like change your model after the fact and go back, and all your skinning is there, is preserved, is not lost. So this, if you've done skinning, Blender is so much ahead of Max was when I used to use Max. I don't know how it is nowadays though. Another advantage is like we could use like our 3D amazing concept art teams to help us, because like we could install the Blender. I taught them how to actually paint inside Blender. So I made like a first pass, and I would send to our concept artists, instead of them doing an overpaint of the change that needs to be done in Photoshop, send me back the file. So I would rework and then send it back. I could just send her the blend file. So she could like use the sculpting tools to adjust the shapes to get a little bit closer of her original intent. And she could even like polish the texture a little bit. And you can see like, but the image speaks by itself. Like I'm a 3D artist, right? So when a 2D artist touched the file, it got so much better right there. So this is just some of the advantages that Blender brought to us. And as I said, when we when we did this Blender group thing inside the Slack channel inside InnoGames, what it happens like we start sharing the love of Blender and all the advantages it have. We even had like some conference inside our own studio, right, where I would show like the things we were doing. And what happened, like some of the leads of other games of InnoGames started seeing that, and they also decided to use Blender. So Blender nowadays being used in pretty much all new games that we are developing, and we have like major things that move towards it. Oh, I think I am too fast. So I am already in the conclusion phase. Sorry, I'm so excited when I talk about Blender, so that can happen. But actually, before I get to the conclusion, what I want to say is it was a very journey to get to this point. Looking like this, it seems like it was all good and easy, but it was not. It was very challenging, like to leave behind the things that you were used to do, right? Like face a new software, start all over again, and then and actually when my project got canceled for the first time, it was exactly like my end of my probation time. So I was like in this situation, like, oh my god, what's gonna happen to me? But you have to be brave. Just go for it, right? You can adapt. That's like the most important thing I want to give, like for people who are searching for a job in the industry, is like be open for new possibilities, because you never know what's gonna come, right? Sometimes if you think like you're taking the wrong path, it can give you an adventure of a lifetime. It can open so many possibilities ahead of you. So just be brave. It's like I when I talk to people who is applying for a job, that's the kind of mentality I want to see them to have. Like be open to new possibilities. Like learn, be share your knowledge. This is the best thing an artist can have. Is just the passion, right? Search for the passion. Don't be afraid. So I'm gonna get to the conclusion now. Still, Joseph Campbell following the whole thing as like the cave you fear to enter, hold the treasure that you seek. So it's exactly that. If you were sometimes like challenging and it's so scary, but you go for it because it might open whole new horizons of possibilities. And Blender was pretty much this for us. And I can say like for InnoGames, Blender was a game changer. I can see like we have now our concept artists wanting to learn Blender. I'm sharing that knowledge with them, getting them motivated, and it expanded the horizon for everybody, because we don't have to buy a license for because to buy a license of 3D Studio Max is pretty expensive for a concept artist who's just gonna use it once in a while. But Blender they can just install and they can just like go for it and ask. We have like programmers getting into photogrammetry, doing with things inside Blender, and we all talk together. So if you want to learn Blender, I advocate like try to create your own community, because this is the sharing is the best part, and the community in Blender is very open. So that is pretty much my talk. I get already to the questions and comments. I think I was too nervous. Sorry about that. Do you have any questions?
Yes. So I switched from 3ds Max to Blender a couple of months ago, and I changed some of the shortcuts to fit what I was used to. More beneficial for me to learn to work with the default shortcuts in Blender so as to communicate with the other team members better, or
Yes.
would it be better to slightly change the hotkeys to better fit past experience?
Okay. This is a good question. Actually, this is something that I also went through. It was like before I burned my boat, before I deleted 3D Studio Max, I tried to use the Blender the same way as Max, so I would be a blame Max thing. And I tell you, it doesn't work. It's the software was built like from the ground to work in this certain way. And if you try to use like actually I learned the old one, the right click select one. Actually, I personally think it's even better than the left click selector that they have now, because like selection is something so important that it should be on the different button than the one we use all the time. But the thing is like all the knowledge about Blender, if you go for there is like this Blender wiki Blender thing that you can search. It's all related to the shortcuts, the original shortcuts of Blender. So if you try to use Max, you're gonna have like to always have like this translation level in between them, and it's gonna confuse you much more. When we had like an animator who joined our team, and he used to use Maya, and he tried to use Blender using Maya shortcuts, and it was a disaster because I couldn't help him because my knowledge of Maya it's not that high. Right, so I know Max, but I didn't know Maya that well to teach him the shortcuts. I knew Blender, but he changed the shortcuts. So I told him, please try to use the Blender shortcuts. At least give it a shot for some months, and then you're gonna when you it's very well thought through the shortcuts of Blender. I believe like if you stick to the shortcuts that comes in Blender, it's gonna be much more beneficial for you, also for like finding extra informations online. So I'll mark as answered. So I have another one. Would you prefer applicants to have Blender experience or any 3D software? It's okay. Yeah. The thing is like I want a person who is a 3D artist. We are not searching like for software specific person. We want to see your artist skill. Your because if you know 3D Studio Max or if you know Maya, I can teach you to use Blender. That was like part of, like we just had like a new artist join our team, and he was a Max user, and now I'm going with him like to the process of getting Blender to get to working to Blender. And it's actually funny because by now he's already fast in Blender, and we even haven't got like the license brought through process yet. So you see, like that's the kind of speed that you can get because he could like as soon as he got in, he could install and then we could go like some basic setup. So it's not about like the oh teaching a software for a person who knows 3D doesn't take that long time. And actually, for me personally, it's better for him to be a little bit slower when he's learning the problem that we use in our pipeline. Then he has a different software because like later, every time we send one file to one program to the other, there is always some glitches on the FBX, and you have to readjust normals. So it pays tenfold after the fact that if he fits in our pipeline. That's like the problem. Like changing pipelines at a project that's already running for so long, it's almost impossible because you already have like all your tools set up. We could change the pipeline for a new project because it was a new project. There was no pipeline defined, so we could define it from the get go. So if we would say like, oh, change now for Max, it would be really hard. We would have to rescript all the tools that our developers did. And we would actually have to give them a license for them to rewrite the scripts in different languages, right? So yeah, so get to know Blender. I would recommend for any 3D artist to learn because like there is the knowledge is always gonna add to you, right? You're not losing anything for learning a new software, but we are not going to discriminate like oh if your portfolio is good and you're good doing Maya or you're doing good soft image, not soft image anymore, but yeah, Maya or Max or any other 3D software, we're not going to say that we're not going to hire because you don't know Blender, right? It's like I hope I answer your question. uh, what is the best way to learn Blender if you are a Mac user? Do you think the M1 chip on the new machines can support it? Yes, the M1 chip is actually supported already for a few versions already. Yeah, that's another good point of Blender that I forgot to mention. Every day there is a new version of Blender. Blender is like recompiled. There is a new daily version with all the new whistles and bells, and you don't have like and the whole development of Blender is open, right? You can just go to the Blender site and see what they are working. So if you want to prepare like a feature that's coming on the pipeline in the future, you already can start learning. For example, we still don't use geometry nodes in our game, but I am already learning geometry nodes because I can see like we're gonna use that in the future. And if it was like a Max thing, it would just come like that. I think Max only does like 1 or 2 versions per year, or maybe 3. A Blender is like every day there is a new thing, and you can ask the director developers like how you work with them. And going back to your question, sorry for the side note. The Mac Mini works great. I have a Mac Mini M1 downstairs that I have a Blender installed on it, and it works great. You can totally use it for 3. Depends on if you want to do. I mean, if you want to do like super detailed sculpts, then I would still think like ZBrush is gonna be even better than Blender for that. But you can totally do very high poly stuff with Blender in the Mac. They can support 3D. Yes, they do very well. I think I'm in the last question. 4 minutes. If someone's company team are cautious about changing pipelines, how do you sell the tool? So that's a great question. The thing is like I think is like be passionate, right? I think if production is already going for some time, it's gonna be really challenging to change. For example, Elvenar is a very old game from InnoGames. It's very famous. Guys don't know, but the pipeline of Elvenar was done in 3D Studio Max. We had like the render. We even had like a render engine, and we could only change the lead of the would become a lead of Elvana join our team, and he was also a 3D Studio Max user, and I went with him to the whole process of getting Blender, and he started liking Blender. He started seeing like the potential of Blender, and when he became the lead of Elvanar, and Elvanar had like some changes in the studio, the outsourcing studio partners that they had. They had like they were brought to, right, so they had to change the outsourcing partners. So this is like the opportunities, like sometimes like things comes that you are forced to change your pipeline anyway, because the way you used to work is not going to work anymore. And that was like for him was the perfect time to just swift, and he switched from 3D Studio Max to Blender because of first he didn't need the render farms anymore, because he could use all the computer for everybody to render, and he was doing like using the compositor that I showed before, just like to adjust like adjust color correction in the files directly inside Blender. And the render with for us, like the render engine of Eve, it was so good and so fast that you didn't spend like before, like for every image it was like taking like 5 minutes to render, and like the Eve was a real time, right? So all the speed that he got by changing the pipeline, it paid tenfold. So, but I'm not trying to say like, yeah, like, oh, change all your pipelines, go everybody to Blender. No, it's like if it makes sense, I would say like study Blender and try to fall in love. If you want to teach someone, it's like the best way is like get them to try, show them the potential, and get like the leads to experiment and see, and show like the possibilities. Because the only way you can actually convince it's like my dad always tells me that it's like this phrase like you never convince someone, you give them elements of conviction, right? You don't push your idea into someone, you just have to give them arguments, and they're gonna get to the conclusion that, oh, perhaps I should change. So I think that's how I would say, like, if you're gonna try to convince like your team like to change, it's just like using it, because it's free. You can open I mean, most companies will be okay with it, so you have on the side, and then you can go showing them slowly, like, look, I can sculpt, I can paint, I can do all this, and it's free, and we can update them much faster, and you can download any version if you want. You don't have to ask for a license for version 3 years ago that we don't have anymore. You can just go to the website. So if you show them like the good things about like changing the pipeline, they might be open to it. So Mark has answered. I think that was. Oh no, there's more. I'm 8 years max user. Do you think suddenly switching to Blender will help me learn better? I don't always want to go back to Zero Max. When I get stuck, I slow down development even more. Yes, exactly. Change your mentality. Just don't be afraid. Like how many years of 3D Studio Max, you don't lose that, right? The things you learn still applies. You just have to learn where the buttons are and the different layout of a program. So your knowledge of 3D you don't lose. You just need to readjust to Blender. And yeah, the worst thing is like try to have both, one leg in each boat, right? Choose one and go with it. I think my time is almost up. So I
Yes,
will ask,
Andrea, thank you so much. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. The questions.
another questions on the Slack thing.
Yeah. If
That
you
was
have a moment to, yeah, if you have the moment to stay a little bit longer and answer questions there, like in the chat, that would be great.
Yes, I'm the whole day in the conference, so if you guys want to talk to me, you can just reach out as well. Okay,
Thank you.
so see you. Bye bye.